This is a video just to show how I've prepared my beds on the allotment. Because this is a London clay, it's very poorly draining, and also the allotment plot is at the bottom of the hill, so the water runs down. It's got a big catchment area from all the other plots above, runs down, and it builds up it drains away into a pond lower down the site, but then that backs up, and then this clay just won't allow any permeation of water to drain away, so it builds up and you end up with a lot of standing water. And topsoil shown here is quite heavy as well. It's not much organic matter in it, and there isn't that much depth. It looks quite deep on here, but it's only around about 4 inches, if that. So what I do here initially, scrape back that layer of topsoil and then mound that up so it's put to one side. And this is clay, so I mean that's pretty grim stuff, but I mean you can soon, if you go down a spit's depth or spade's depth, yeah, after about 4 inches you hit that clay. So you can just scrape the topsoil off to one side. It doesn't matter if there's a bit of clay in it, it's not too bad, but you don't want to dig out the clay and disturb that because there's no point, because what we're trying to do is really raise up this area. So what I've shown here, these are the 25 litre reclaimed HDPE containers which I'm using as worm beds. So I'll just stack those up straight on the clay, or you could put a bit of wood chip under there, but it doesn't matter because the worms will work organic matter into that clay, and it will loosen up over time anyway, so you don't need that layer initially. And what you're doing here is you're digging out that material, and then you put it into one side so you can use that topsoil, so you're not just purely adding organic matter on top, you're working that soil into the bed as well. So what I've shown here, just logs, so you can use logs, Christmas trees, fir trees from Christmas, they're always good. Pallet wood, if it's been heat treated rather than fumigated or treated with insecticides, so they're readily available from garden centres and nurseries and things like that. They're stamped up, got an HT for heat treatment. I'm not really sure in terms of problems with using pallets if they haven't been heat treated. These are just breaking down, but it seems sort of counterintuitive to actually use stuff that's been treated with a fungicide. So yeah, heat treated pallets are good, or you can use softwood offcuts or hardwood offcuts from a sort of timber yard if there's one available. If there's somewhere near a wood where they provide firewood, you might ask if you can take some of their chainsaw sawdust shavings and things like that. So it's just adding organic matter, but organic matter you can find for free. So if there's any local gardeners to you, they might have waste in a builder's bag or something like that. So you can say, can I take any of that garden waste, all the twiggy stuff? And then what you really want to do is have the heavier logs at the bottom, and then work in looser and looser twiggy material as you get up. What I'm showing here is just a source of greens. So this could be anything. It could be green manure, it could be kitchen waste, it could be hedge prunings, it could be even leaves. So it's really, I'm just trying to work in a source of green. So that's the sort of nitrogenous material as opposed to the wood, which is mainly carbon. Yeah, so it just means there's a mix of greens, and so you might use animal manures and things like that, or rabbit pet bedding and things as well. So yeah, it's just you're just trying to equalize that sort of nitrogen lockup that you get from that wood as it breaks down. So you're putting something back, but really the wood adds structure, it adds air spaces, and it adds drainage. So as it rains, the water, rather than hitting this clay layer and running off, or sitting there and this soil becoming waterlogged, and if you've got waterlogged soil, all the worms will have to move somewhere else. So if this is waterlogged for 4 to 6 months of the year, you're not going to have any worm activity, so those worms are going to go higher up the hill. So you're already losing the benefit of all that worm activity in terms of adding aeration and improving drainage and things like that. So what you do here, loads and loads of logs, as much as you can, as you're willing to bring in, or as little as you're willing to bring in, really. So don't go crazy, but this just demonstrates that you can raise an instant raised bed just by providing organic matter and using organic matter as free. So these are soil feeding stations. So I've made videos about those before. You've got holes in these, and then that allows the worms to work in. But what the idea of the the soil feeding stations is that will actually be a path when this is made as a raised bed. I've just shown a one raised beds. You want to do the same thing with here. So you'd have a path and then hugelkultur and then animal manures, but I've just shown that you're moving that topsoil to one side. So you're preparing this area here. So this is path, and then this will be the raised bed. What I've shown here is just when you get Christmas trees, there's obviously the base of the trunk is quite thick, maybe 3 or 4 inches, and then they taper out to nothing where the little twigs are at the top. So when you lay those down in this, well, it is a trench really. Just alternate them, so top to bottom and bottom to top, so they're sort of triangular and they fit in quite well. But doesn't matter, because the voids and things will allow airspace in there, and then the manures and green waste will work in there, and obviously eventually over time these will break down completely. So what I've shown here, soil feeding station. On this one I've just shown it a little bit higher, so I can put some wood chip in here. I've got a log on end here as a retaining, not as a retaining wall, but just sort of holds that material back, stops it rolling into here when you take these soil feeding stations out. So the green is could be animal manures or kitchen waste, and then a source of brown, so that might be twiggy material, and then maybe another source of what I normally do is take the topsoil in this layer, and then I add part composted material or contents from worm beds where it's not completely broken down. But then you're finishing off with a sort of cover of finished off compost really. So what I'd like to sort of give you the impression of is that you're working from fresh woody material, which is really hard to break down, takes years to break down, which is great because it's down there, it's doing a good job, it's adding aeration and a kind of place for the water to drain away and soak into. Then you've got your animal wastes, which is too much nitrogen, so you can't grow plants into that. And then as you're working up, then you've got a layer of soil, and then you've got more and more finer, sort of more and more completed composts. So the nice stuff is really just so it looks pretty on top. But when you're growing crops, you don't need to have sifted compost or anything like that. Or it doesn't have to be stuff you buy from a big box store or whatever. So this is just goes to show that, yeah, the finished stuff on top. So you've got something when you're sowing seeds and young plants, they've got something friable to work into. And then as this material breaks down, as those plants grow over the season, this material is getting progressively more and more broken down. But just means rather than using things like wood chippers to mulch down all the woody material, you can actually just put it in there. It's not because it almost looks like you're just burying rubbish and waste, but what you're doing here, because you've got aeration from that loggy, the twiggy material and the logs and things, even though it is a couple of feet deep, you're still going to get air through there, because the top layer of compost will be about a foot deep, and then you can still get aeration through that compost and through the worm activity. And obviously here you've got a vertical sort of worm tower as well, so there is a cycle of movement through and even into the clay as well. So that by no means it's not like a landfill site. You're not dumping organic material and burying it, although you're covering it with a little layer of compost. But the idea is that these logs have got their own airspace, it's not compacted down, and the worms will be adding air, and there'll be moisture in there as well. So if you just dug a hole straight in the clay without that organic matter, when it rained it would tend to fill up and it'd be like a sump. But because you've got the wood here and the logs, they'll build up, you'll get a capillary action of the water, and the moisture will wick up into this bed here. And obviously if you had maybe 100 millimeters of rain, there's sufficient organic matter there for that just to permeate down and be held into that compost. And even during what you'll notice with these kind of beds is over a wet winter, rather than having standing water and puddles and waterlogged soil, the top layer of this will be lovely and moist, and there'll be lots of fungi and worm activity and soil life and rove beetles and wood lice. But then as you get further down, you can even have a sort of fairly dry layer under here. So it will take a huge amount of rainfall, and then that will just be stored into that soil, and then it will have ongoing benefits rather than in effect just waterlogging and making this anaerobic, because there's just too much water there. There's not enough oxygen, you won't have any worms, because the worms will actually drown if they're in there over a period of time. So you need that aeration, and what you're doing here is you're making a great big depth of organic matter, but you're adding soil structure as well in the forms of these logs and twigs as well. What I have found is when I was moving towards making composts in these sort of beds, and then thinking, oh, what I'll do is I'll take that material out there when it's composted and put it straight onto this bed. But that is clay. That's really awful. This is waterlogged. That's heavy. It will work over time, but you can't gain that much depth by continuing adding thin mulches of material, because that mulch will be worked into the compost, into the soil, and it'll break down the soil. It'll make the soil more workable, but you won't gain that initial massive depth of organic matter, and that's really what I'm interested in. So if you can see here, if that was mirrored onto the other side of it, when it rains, you've got this worm bed here, and that will be about 2 feet, and then that might be 2'6". So yeah, you could literally have, if this was just over the one area and there wasn't the catchment over the rest of the allotment, you could have 2 foot of rain, which is ridiculous, but it still wouldn't waterlog. It would actually have somewhere to drain down into. Otherwise, if it's just like this with the heavy compacted soils, and there's no organic matter, so if you walk on that, that will just completely knock the life out of it. It would just be almost like puddled clay. But this, on the other hand, you can walk on this and you can actually feel it. It's springy. It's like walking in the woods on the sort of leaf mold and almost like chip bark or something like that. So it is, you literally can feel the difference. And this will be slippery, wet clay. You have it all caked onto your boots. Any organic matter in sort of logs and bits of bark and things will just get pressed into that clay. So this, on the other hand, because there's structure in there and soil life, maintaining these air passages and airways through there, then that will, it doesn't compact down. You can walk on that. I don't walk on my beds anyway. I don't see the point really, because I'd like to have raised beds and walk on the paths, and then just be able to tend that bed, because it's only sort of 120 millimeters, sort of 4 feet wide. But the idea of these is really it minimises the amount of compost bins. So otherwise wasted area in a path, you can just literally lift that container out and then put the worm castings and part composted or rough compost. It might not be pure castings, but then you can circulate that round. So you're from elsewhere, you're pre-composting material, putting it back into these worm beds, and then putting it into the raised beds. So it's a real continuous cycle, and then these in themselves will just maintain that level of fertility. So it's stop it from settling down as organic matter is worked in. So you're renewing or replenishing what's being used during the growing season. But this is really just for ongoing benefit and the initial sort of soil structure, which isn't there because you're on this kind of unworked clay. This is on my allotment, it's actually Boulder Clay. So you've got big bits of chalk, flint, and some, where this has been pulverized by sort of glacial activity, it's really sharp pieces of flint held together in a real yellow London clay. So that is, it's almost like it's reinforced with these bits of rock and stone, like concrete. So that's absolutely horrific stuff. And over time, then obviously the worms and the organic matter will tend to permeate down. But what happens with this is it maintains that moisture in that clay, and you don't get that in summer. It doesn't get baked hard, so you don't get that runoff. So it will drain better here than it will on here, which it will just run off and then pool up, and then you'll end up with horrible sort of stagnant puddles of clay water. So what I'm really trying to show is that you don't need to have a compost bin and then finish compost and then put a little layer of compost down on this little pretty mulch on the beds. You can almost this is composting in situ. This is like lasagna gardening, hugelkultur, and no dig, but combined into one. So I use little bits of different gardening techniques, and these soil feeding stations, I thought, well, if one works, then a row of 10 work 10 times as well. So, and this is scaffold boards. And what I do initially, the scaffold boards, if you've got rodents around, if this is all fairly friable compost, the rodents will be able to dig down. A bit of scaffold board or fence post or whatever, it just stops them from working into that worm bed, because there'll be loads of worms there, so they'll be attractive to foxes and rats as well. But by having that, it makes a physical barrier And if there's any digging here, it's easy just to go around with a boot and compact that around the edge, or even get a couple of bits of brick or whatever if it's settled, and so you've got something to stop the rats from going in there. But as I said, that is part composted material in there as well. It's not really fresh kitchen scraps. But what I tend to do is build up a bedding of part composted material. When there's a nice worm population in there, then as this settles down, I'll just lift the board occasionally and then put some waste, kitchen waste and things in there, just to keep it topped up. Or what you alternatively can do, because there's a number of these, as they settle down, you can lift one container and then tip it from that one container into the other one to top those up, and then put fresh part composted material in these. If you've got compost bins, it makes sense to keep them running to capacity. If they're just empty, they're they're obviously not doing anything. But yeah, it's really, this is where you've got really heavy clay and a very minimal topsoil, and your topsoil is quite precious, so you want to kind of keep as much of that as you can, but then also work in the sort of long-term organic matter to break down, but to really give you that depth. These are raised beds, but they're raised above the subsoil, but I kind of like to keep the paths raised as well. If you didn't have this soil feeding station, then you'd need to use logs or pallet wood or scaffold boards to make a raised bed, and that's a lot of material, and the material will break down as well, and there's an expense. So you have a little edging there initially, but once the soil structure is built up in there, you don't really need that. It won't be compacted, but that compost will sort of hold its shape, and then these will just be able to drop in and then just lift that board. Obviously the boards will rot down, but if I'm using scaffold boards, these are reclaimed materials anyway, so they're not that expensive to pick up. And by making, if you imagine there's a raised bed around the actual path, you haven't actually got a completely raised bed all around or haven't got wood all around the sides of the raised bed, so it reduces the amount of materials. So you could just have, rather than a piece of wood across here. And with the raised beds, I just tend to round them off so the compost doesn't roll down onto the paths as well. But if you mulch the path right up to the top of the raised bed with wood chip, then yeah, you're not using any wooden edging or gravel boards or anything like that. Once again, thanks for watching. I hope you've found some value in this video too.